Well, it's time now for the France 24 debate. Today, we're getting a check on the state of security here in France. A man is currently under arrest after a car was driven into a group of soldiers in a western Paris suburb on Wednesday morning. 6 of those soldiers have been injured. All of them were a week into their deployment as part of the nationwide Opération Sentinelle. That's the security operation that's brought thousands of security services onto the streets of France since the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo magazine, on a police officer and a Jewish supermarket in January 2015. Now, members of that operation have faced half a dozen attacks now this year, so can we say it's still working? What impact on security might the new but politically inexperienced Emmanuel Macron have? And can France learn lessons from other countries? Let's bring in our guests, a security specialist who advises heads of state and government on how to counter threats, CEO of Moscon, Yann Saint-Pierre, joining us from Berlin. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
And from London, Joseph Downing, who's a specialist in French politics, security and Muslims in France, also Marie Curie Fellow at France's National Centre for Scientific Research. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, first question I'd like to put to both of you. Can we still say that Operation Sentinelle is still working? First to you, Joseph Downing.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to say because it wasn't that effective in stopping the attacks on the Bataclan and the other sites in Paris that happened that fateful sort of night in Paris. And it seems that the soldiers themselves are becoming quite a target for terrorists in France. I mean, it's something that I notice when I'm in France, just how exposed these poor young sort of soldiers are patrolling the streets of French cities. Yet we don't know really what effect they've had as a deterrent for other kinds of large-scale attacks. So it's actually really quite difficult to say.
All right, same question to you, Yann Saint-Pierre. There have been attacks since Operation Sentinelle was put in place, but perhaps many more have been averted.
Yes, but that's always very difficult to ascertain because people that are deterred by these the presence of soldiers and police officers in the streets don't necessarily say afterwards, "Well, I was planning this," and the fact that police were there or military was there, I stopped. The fact is, it is highly debatable whether Sentinelle really works, and it does provide a much more a larger pool of targets for would-be terrorists. And one of the paradoxes, historically, the classic target for terrorists has always been police and military. In Turkey, we see it very often with the PKK. We saw it, the IRA and British troops in Northern Ireland. So it's sort of basically offering them more targets on a pedestal, and that's very difficult.
Well, I'll stay with you then, Yann Saint-Pierre. You advise heads of state and government. Emmanuel Macron, just a couple of weeks into the job, what would you advise him to do?
Well, I like very much the approach that the British are using with Operation Temporary, which is basically to have undercover security officers, not just police, but highly trained military personnel in very what they call sensitive areas, and to have a ring of steel. If for example, around Westminster, yes, there were 2 attacks, but on the other hand, many were thwarted, and those were actually recorded. So I think the fact that you can move away from the classic idea of showing more strength is a good deterrent. I think reverting to a more subtle aspect would work very well. And I think understanding that there's no magic solution to terrorism, that it needs to be addressed, that all of its aspects need to be addressed simultaneously is very important.
Well, I'll put that point to you then, Joseph Downing. You're there in London as you speak to us. This different approach that Yann Saint-Pierre brought up, that British police are taking, do you see that there is a better approach, can we say it that way, in the UK? Because, of course, the UK has suffered several large-scale attacks in recent months.
Well, see, this is the thing. I mean, it's quite hard to say because this approach hasn't stopped the bloodshed in, the London Bridge terrorist attack, where kind of, innocent people not enjoying their Friday night were targeted by terrorists right here on the streets of London in the midst of what is perhaps one of the biggest security operations in British history, bringing this kind of ring of steel to bear on London. So, I mean, it seems to me that these kinds of approaches are pretty flawed. I mean, it seems to me that Operation Sentinelle from the outset was really more about reassuring the public than actually really about doing anything substantive to prevent a security threat. Where I do agree with your other guests actually is the intelligence-led approach is the key. And I think this is where really France really has to get its act together and really actually work on building intelligence-led policing, intelligence-led counter-terrorism on the ground, which I think is something that France has actually done quite badly.
Well, if we pick up on that point, one of the problems that has come to light ever since the Charlie Hebdo attacks in particular has been this the lack of clarity between the different security services in France, perhaps a lack of fluid communication between them, some of them out and out not talking to each other. Yann Saint-Pierre, do you see that that situation has improved over time?
It's improved over the last 18 months to 2 years, especially since November 2015. Unfortunately, the catching up was the distance between where terrorists are and what's needed and what was happening at the time within security services. The gap was so big that catching up will take many more years actually, because you have to overcome the culture that was there that was almost generational. You have to also overcome the petty competitiveness between the different agencies, between the different security forces, who has priority. They try to change that, but it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of the pride factor also plays a big role. So a lot of them need to start learning, well, working together might help a bit more, but it's very, very difficult.
And if I stay with you, Yann Saint-Pierre, we know that Emmanuel Macron has said that he wants to spend more money on security issues. Perhaps money not necessarily the key to this then?
Well, it depends how you spend it. Obviously, you have many countries that spend outrageous amounts of money fighting terrorism, but they only spend it, for example, on buying more weapons or investing in technology. As I mentioned earlier, fighting terrorism is about being able to be versatile, to be multilateral, to be, work on multiple facets at the same time. And if they stop investing in one magic solution, for example, the issue of de-radicalization in France has been very thorny. Does it work? Doesn't it work? There has been a lot of criticism. The fact is de-radicalization is only part of the solution. It can work just like the military and the police as well. So good thing that finances are available. The question is, will it be spent intelligently?
Well, I'm very pleased that you brought up de-radicalisation, because that is where I wanted to go next. We know that here in France, many of the people who've committed acts in recent times in France are from France. We don't hear as much talk about longer-term issues such as de-radicalisation. Joseph Downing, I know that you have a specialist background in the societal problems that can be the root causes of radicalisation. How would you assess France's attitude towards this aspect of the picture?
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive problem for France, and it's only really going to get worse over the next 5 to 10 years when jihadists abroad. I mean, France has got some of the largest numbers for any European country of jihadists that have gone to join ISIS in Iraq and Syria. When they come back, because some of them will, this is going to be a massive problem that France really has to get a grip on. Again, it's something that France has been quite reluctant to really pick up on. There hasn't been an attempt to kind of there's been a lot of sort of lip service paid to trying to get some kind of strategy in place, but just the general kind of social contact, the institutions, the people that are on the ground that could do this kind of job are not really there. And exactly as your guest says, to put anything like this in place, it takes so many years to build up the capacity, the well-trained staff, the institutions that, I mean, it's something that France is really doing quite badly. But saying that, at the same time, France would do quite well to listen more actually to its own Muslim communities. The two brothers behind the Charlie Hebdo attack were well known to local Muslims in their area as a potential problem. They were known as having a large weapons cache inside their flat. They were, caught sort of hoarding weapons by a Muslim neighbour. But the Muslim neighbour didn't feel confident going to the police in France. They didn't feel confident the police would, A, do anything, or B, protect them. And this is where, a sort of community policing, community intelligence-based approach, I think would be, very useful.
Well, we know that France does have a very thorny relationship with its Muslim communities. We've seen various attempts by the French state to get to grips with that. There don't seem to be any easy solutions, though. Do you have any suggestions about how France can get to grips with this?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, listen to its own Muslim citizens, who are some of the best integrated Muslims actually in Europe. I mean, if you go and look at any of the large-scale surveys that have been done by sociologists in France, French Muslims overwhelmingly feel French and want to stay in France, you know, like democratic institutions, like the way of life that they've got in France. You know, I've got no support for terrorist organisations. And it's building bridges with those communities that really in the long term is what France needs to do. I mean, the problem is, in a secular state that adheres to laïcité, that seems to, you know, spend its time regulating women's swimwear, as we saw in the bikini ban, or overt religious symbols and stuff like that, they're kind of, from my perspective, putting their effort into the wrong fields.
Well, if I come back to Yann Saint-Pierre, on the issue of de-radicalisation that you brought us on to, some people say that de-radicalisation efforts, sending people off to special centres, that kind of thing, it's akin to hug a hoodie, you know, trying to cure a problem with love, and when really harsher punishments are being put forward as a better alternative. I have heard a lot of people here in France in recent months saying that they want the death penalty to be brought back for people that are found guilty of terrorist acts. It's popular opinion among many people. Do you think that harsher punishments would be a good alternative?
Well, my experience has been that with terrorists or would-be terrorists, there's no general solution to it. Some will only respond to harsh methods. Some will only respond to having a gun pointed at their face. Some will react to, you know, maybe a lesser form of punishment, and some will actually react to a hug. It sounds weird to put it that way, but this is the reality of it, is that there's no general pattern that you can use to say, well, this works better, this doesn't work better. They've tried many forms of deterrence. Many countries have very stringent laws. There's the death penalty in the United States, for example. It hasn't deterred anybody from doing it, very often because there's also these suicide attacks. So a death penalty wouldn't deter anybody who's already willing to kill himself, to kill others. But again, it's on a case-by-case basis. And what we really need as a solution is a system, is a train of thought that will allow us to adapt and be fluent enough to be able to adjust our solutions to the required needs at a given time.
Well, same question then back to Joseph Downing. Harsher punishments, how effective do you think that threat could be?
Well, I think I'll pick up on what your other guest said, actually, which I totally agree with. It's really problematic because these people actually want to die, right? So the death penalty is not going to be a deterrent for somebody who is setting out explicitly for that purpose. And we can see, you know, if you look at the Middle East and the fight with radical Islam that began really in the kind of late 60s, early 70s in places like Egypt, Syria, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, these places had really, really tough penalties for terrorism, torture, death, solitary confinement. I mean, the worst kinds of punishments you can think of were meted out, and it really didn't have much of an effect. It didn't really deter those people who wanted to go down that road from going down that road. And this is where I think, bringing up again what your guest said, you need to be quite agile in these circumstances in terms of adapting a solution to a case-by-case basis. The problem is, saying that you want agility isn't very good in terms of building political support, because people want a firm kind of solution, a simple solution put in quite simple terms. And also, it can be difficult in some ways to build an institution around agility, precisely because, you know, for an institution you have to have rules. These institutions often are very closely monitored for what they're doing. They need to be quite careful about accountability in terms of problems with violating human rights. So it's a very difficult balancing act.
Indeed. Really. A complex situation facing France, facing many countries around the world right now. Thank you so much for giving us your thoughts. Joseph Downing speaking to us there from London, and also Yann Saint-Pierre of Moscon speaking to us from Berlin. Thank you both. And that does wrap up today's France 24 debate. Do stay tuned to France 24.